Welcome to this video tutorial about Python TCP sockets. We'll have two prerequisites for this one. You will need basic understanding of networking concepts like the client-server model and addressing a network. And you also need the knowledge of Python programming language, because this tutorial is entirely based on Python. And we'll have two main goals in this tutorial. The first one will be creating a TCP client, and the second one will be creating a TCP server. And we'll use this server to receive data from the client we've created in the previous section, and this will send some data back to it. So we will start with the first section, which will be creating a TCP client, and it will have four basic steps. First one will be creating a TCP socket object, and then we'll connect it to a server, which in this case will be google.com, and the third step will be sending data to the server, and then we will receive data from the server. So let's get started. So I'm using Python shell here, or if you want to save your script, you can use the text editor. And we will start with importing the socket module. And now that we have imported the socket module, and we will create a socket object and we'll name it client, and we'll pass two arguments into it. The first one will be this, and this will mean that it is going to take an IPv4 address, and the second argument will mean that this is going to be a TCP oriented socket. So now that we've created the socket object, now we can connect it to a server. For that we will need the IP address of the server. To get the IP address, you need to know the name of the server, the host name, and this will be for this the syntax will be socket.getHost by name, and the name of the host, which we're gonna use google.com, and for this you will also need an internet connection, and we'll name this all as IP, and we'll hit enter. And this is successful, and now if you want to see the IP address, you can print it. And so this is the IP address of google.com. So now that we have the IP address, we will now need the port. So we'll create a variable named port and put the value 80 into it. Now we have the IP address and the port. So now we'll bind this all into a tuple, which we will name as address. So we have our address of a server which we're going to connect to in this variable, and now we can simply connect to the server. For this, the syntax will be client.connect, and this will take arguments as the address of the server which we are going to connect to. So client.connect to address, and now we will hit enter to see if it is successful. So no errors, and this is successful. Client is connected to the server. So we have now established a connection with google.com, and after that we can send some data to it. So we can type client.send, and if you want to receive the data back, receive some data back, then you will need to send a valid data, which I've already copied, and this will be this, and this is a valid data to send to google.com, and now we'll hit enter. And so now it was successful, and now we can also receive some data from it. So for syntax for that will be client.recv, and the buffer size which we're going to receive, which in this case I'm going to use 1024. And so Google has sent some data back to us. So this is the data which Google has sent. So now that we've accomplished all the goals of section 1, which was creating the simplest of a TCP client, and the entire script for this. There it is. And now we'll move on to the next section, which will be creating a TCP server. So we're now gonna get started with the section B, and now we'll create a TCP server and use our client to communicate with it. So this section will have 5 basic steps, and we'll start with creating a TCP socket object and then binding it to an address. The address will have an IP address and a port. So this will be the address on which our server will work on and will be used when we want to connect a client to it. And then we'll start listening on our server and we'll be able to receive an incoming connection from a client. After getting the connection, we'll be able to communicate with the server, and the server will receive data from a client and then reply accordingly. So now we'll get started with it, and this time I'm not going to use the Python shell, and instead we're going to put a script into a file. So you can use any text editor you want, but I recommend using the editors which have syntax highlighting for Python. So in this case I'm going to use Vim, or you can use Notepad++ or other IDEs for Python. So we'll start with an empty file, and the first step, of course, will be to import the socket module, and then we'll create a socket object. And now that we've created the socket object, we will now need to bind this object to an address, and the address will have the IP address. In this case we are going to use the IP address of our own computer, so a server needs to get the IP address of the computer. You can get the IP address if you know the name of the host, and to get the name you can go to properties of your computer and scroll down and you'll get the name here. Or if you don't want to do that, you can do that through a script. So to get the name of the host, you can use socket.get host name, and you can see the name by printing the variable. So the name of my host is Jarvis. And to get the IP address to the name, you can use socket.get host by name, and it will take the name of the host as the arguments, and here we get the IP address of the host computer. So we'll put this into a program. So the IP address will be get host by name and get host name. And now that we have the IP address, we'll need a port, and we'll keep it a 4-digit integer, and we'll put the IP address and the port into a tuple named address. So now we have the address on which we're going to bind our server. So the simple syntax: server.bind and the address. And after binding it to the address, we can start listening on the server and try and receive connections. So we'll use the syntax, which will be server.listen, and it will take an integer argument. This integer specifies that how many connections it can take up at a single time. So in this case we'll keep 1, and that means that only one client can connect to it at a time, and if the second client tries to connect, the connection will be refused. So now that we've started listening, we can print this onto the screen. And to make it look more professional, you can also print the IP address and the port. And now that we've started listening, we'll be able to receive the incoming connections from the client. So the syntax for that is server dot accept, which accepts the incoming connection, and we need a variable to store the data. And this function actually returns two variables. The one is the client object, and the other one is the address of the client object. So we'll put a comma in between and we'll get both of these values. So after getting the connection, you can print this also onto the screen. Got a connection from, and the IP of the client. So you need to know that the IP address is stored in the first memory location and the port is stored in the second one. So you can print the details of the client, and after printing the details you will start the communication work with the client. And to make sure you communicate continuously with it until the client wants to close the connection, you can put a while loop. So while true equal to true, while true is true, this loop will run, or it will only stop executing if a break statement is reached. And so now we have connected to a client, and we can receive some data from that. And so we'll put all that into the data variable, and the data variable will be equal to client.recv and the buffer size of the data, which we're going to keep 1024. And we can print this onto the screen, what we have received from the client. And now we can print that we are going to start processing the data. And now we'll start with processing the data. You can do it in any way you want, but in my case I'm going to do it this way. So if the data will be equal to hello server, then we'll reply hello client. So our client will receive hello client if it sends hello server. And this will be our valid data, so we'll print it onto the screen that reply has been sent and the processing has been completed. And if the data is not hello server, and if it is disconnect, then we'll close the client. This means that the client now wants to disconnect, and so we'll close the connection. So else if data is equal to disconnect, so we'll first send a goodbye message to the client, and then we'll close the client. And now that our client is closed, so if this loop runs again, then this statement will give error because the client has been closed now. And so we want our loop to stop executing after the client has been closed, so we'll put a break statement here. If data is disconnect, then the client will be closed and then the loop will be terminated. And if the data is none of these, that means the data is invalid. So we'll first send to the client that the data was not valid. Client dot send invalid data, the simple syntax, and now we can print this onto the screen. And it will reply that the data was invalid and print this stuff onto the screen. So now we have finished writing the script, and we'll save it and run it to check if we have any errors. So no errors yet, and it has started listening on this address. And now we'll make a client and connect to it. And now we'll connect to it, connect to this address. So this is the same, so we can copy this entire into this, and we need to keep this as string. So we'll put this in the inverted commas, and then the port is 1234, and you need to make sure that you have 2 brackets here and 2 here, because this is going to be single argument, because this is the address and this is only one argument. Then we'll press enter, and you can see the reaction here that it prints that it has received connection from this address. Now that we've connected to the server, we can send and receive some data. So we'll start with sending data. Send any random data, and it reacts to this, that it has received this from the client, and then it starts processing, and the data was invalid, and it replies something, and now we'll receive the reply. And the buffer size here, so it has replied that the data was invalid. So here you can see that you're using 2 statements, one after the other. You're first sending the data and receiving the data manually. Or if you want to do this quickly, you can define a function and do it multiple times using a single statement, which will send the data and print the data which was received. So we'll call this communicate, which will take some data as arguments, and it will first send the data to the client, and then we'll print the response. And now we'll test our function. Send any random data, and so it sends the data and prints the data which was received. So you can see the reaction here too. And now we'll send some valid data. So if you look at the script, the valid data was hello server. So we'll send this, and it replies to us hello client, and you can see this here, processing done. And if we'll have a look at the script, the code to disconnect the client was simply the disconnect, and if we send disconnect, then the client will be closed and the server will terminate. So we'll try this here. And so it prints receive disconnect from the client and processing, and the server gets terminated, and it also sends us a goodbye message. So now our server will no longer communicate with us. You can test this. So it will print an error message. So because connection was aborted by the software host on our machine, so no data can be received. So now we have accomplished all the goals in section B, and we have now reached the end of this tutorial. And if this proves to be helpful, please subscribe for more stuff like this, and thanks for watching.